So we're going to move on to the winery, things that you can do. And this is specifically kind of thinking about fermentation, maceration. I always tell people that the most important thing to do is, as that fruit shows up at your receiving door, look at that fruit, understand that fruit, and hopefully you spend some time in the vineyard that that fruit came from, because that gives you a lot of cues as to how you should manage that fruit in the winery. Most important thing, understand your fruit. Second most important thing, understand your wants. We all have a style that we love and desire. That fruit may not want to be that wine, okay? And that's where problems can start to crop up. You've got a fruit, you've got a style preference, and you try to stuff this fruit into that style. And that's where you start to have issues. So the best experienced winemakers know what they're working with, and they're going to make the wine that that fruit wants to be. And that's about all you can do, okay? If you want to make this style, and this fruit's not doing it for you, then you keep looking for that right fruit. Does that make sense? A real important component to think about. And then I work for a large winery. It's important to understand your market. Yeah, very important. You can make the best wine in the world, but it might not sell. So these are some tools in the toolbox that we think of at the fermentation maceration level. The two most important variables during this period of time are time and temperature. All right? How long that juice is allowed to stay in contact with the source of tannin and the temperature at which it's kept at. The concentration gradient is another important thing. That's why one of the most important reasons why we do punch downs, pump overs, is to keep that concentration gradient as high as possible. As the tannin extracts out of that plant cell and into the liquid that's surrounding it, you get locally high concentrations of tannin, which ultimately slow down the rate of extraction. So that's why we want to keep mixing the liquid to keep the concentration as high as concentration gradient as high as possible. Aspect ratios: the wider the tank is relative to the height, the thinner the cap is, the more slowly that concentration gradient breaks down. And then thinking about compounds of interest as a function of those tools. These are some other things that you want to be thinking about. We talked about how you perceive tannins, and it's also important to be thinking about all these other matrix aspects as well as exogenous adds that can affect perception of things ultimately. Cell permeability, enzyme adds. Who adds enzymes to ferments today to try to facilitate extraction? And it's all about trying to get that extraction up front. This is, we talked about the vineyard. The vineyard comes back to the winery. During berry development, from fruit set to veraison, these compounds are made. And if you just follow the sensory aspect of those compounds, they contribute bitterness, astringency, and sourness to a wine. And if you have an excessive amount of that in your wine, you might call it hard, cream, gorse, unripe in terms of the tannin. As you move into fruit ripening, you start to form color in your grapes. You produce potential ethanol, sugar, polysaccharides in color, contributing body and sweetness, fat, thick if you have an excessive amount of that. So it's really what we're after in terms of balancing that and the role that fruit development plays in those adjectives. So if you have too much tannin and acid in your wine, you've got this, what this thing looks like. These are some tools that you might think about playing with to get that teeter-totter balanced off in this direction. So it's really about reducing this, increasing this, okay? Conversely, too much of this, these are some of the tools that you might be thinking about to try to increase this, okay? And so anytime you have a wine that's it's not quite right in this world, go back to this sheet and just kind of play around with what stage in the production process are you at and what tools do you have at your disposal that you, from a stylistic standpoint, can cope with, and then from a timing standpoint, our ability to actually execute. Is that all good? So this is some research that Ralph Yacco did. This was some wineries in the Napa Valley, 5 wineries, commercial winemakers. And this gets back to my research area, which is compositional elements of how you can affect quality. And we're going back to this tannin activity thing. We talked about the shape of that astringency curve, right? So more active tannin, the duration of the astringency is longer relative to the peak of its astringency, less active tannins the other way, okay? So early in a wine's life, you tend to have more active tannin. It's a coarser tannin, and that's why you want to barrel age this stuff for a while so it softens up, okay? The question that we asked the winemakers was, we want you to do what you do in the Napa Valley, and we just want to grab samples from must to final product, and we're going to isolate those tannins, understand what the tannin composition looks like, to see if we can find relationships between what you do as winemakers and what we see in the chemistry lab, to see if we can start to get some clues as to tannin activity relationships. So here's tannin activity. This is a principal component analysis of all the chemistry that we did to those tannins to see what's driving activity. And the biggest thing that drove activity really is about size of the tannin, okay? There's some compositional variables here that would tease out things like proportion of skin tannin and seed tannin. Didn't relate. Okay? How much pigmented tannin was in the system? Didn't relate. What really drove it home was simply size. Okay? So it's not that seed tannin is a coarser tannin or a skin tannin is a softer tannin. It might have more to do with the timing of extraction of a skin tannin versus a seed tannin, or the ease with which a seed tannin is extracted versus a skin tannin. But in the realm of Napa Valley and how they make wine, over the course of these 5 wineries, working with Cabernet Sauvignon from 7 days of soak to 62 days of soak, the thing that drove it the strongest was the size of the tannin. Okay? Interestingly enough, the year after this study was done, we did a Napa Valley survey of vineyards from veraison through harvest, and did the same exact study with the fruit. And then we extracted the fruit into a model ethanol system, looked at the tannins in that situation. Interesting thing in that case, the PCA almost is exactly alike, this one, with the exception of this component here, pigmented polymer. Pigmented polymer was almost opposite here, indicating that we want pigmented tannin in our wine, but the best place to achieve that is in the vineyard. It's not going to happen at this stage of production. And the interesting thing, even more so, is that we took a 60-day ferment, which is, you know, two months soak time, right? And the concept of extended maceration gives you a softer wine. Why does it give you a softer wine? And the things tend to be because you start to form pigmented tannin, or you're mildly oxidizing that tannin and it's changing the shape, which makes it less susceptible to astringency. We didn't find either of those to be the case. In fact, the longer you soak that material, the less pigmented the tannin became, and the more grape-like the tannin became in terms of structure, okay? So you're asking the question, well, what the hell's going on? It was really about size. As that tannin soaked in that fermenter for longer and longer and longer, the tannins got smaller and smaller and smaller. And that made that tannin less active and less active and less active, which gives you the perception of the softening effect. Does that make sense? For some of you, it probably does. And that's the counterintuitive component of it. So with that 2-month soak time, what we actually saw is a reduction in concentration and a reduction in size at the same time. And that's the interesting thing, right? Because tannins give you bitterness and astringency. So the question you have to ask is, at what point is that tannin no longer bitter? And you don't want that, right? Bitterness is not a good thing. But how about just on the other side of the fence, where it's not bitter, but it's astringent? It's a very transient astringency when it's very small like that. Not small enough to be bitter, but just astringent. And that's what we saw, is there was more of that material in that fermenter.
Over the last 2 vintages, I've seen extended maceration make very harshly tannic and bitter wines.
Yeah.
And so now I'm working on getting rid of those with the tannin additions you're finding.
And so tannin addition to mask the bitterness that's in there. And that's the other thing about extended macerations. You're changing the concentration of the tannin, and that concentration I've seen go up, I've seen it go down, I've seen it stay the same. It can do anything. But you're clearly changing the size of the tannin. The question is, what's driving it ultimately? And that's where the experience needs to happen, because you can definitely overdo it.